Thank you very much for coming for this wonderful lecture. I know that's what it will be. Before I introduce Professor Friedlander, I would like to tell you, because I was told that I must not forget and that I will suffer terrible consequences if I would forget it. So I must tell you that after the lecture, there will be a brunch at the Ackerman Center upstairs. So please do come and please join us for this brunch, okay? I would like, I think nothing else is on my conscience. Otherwise, I would like to, and in the first place, introduce to you Professor Saul Friedlander, who is, put it somehow in some objective ways, but there is no other way to formulate it, really one of the greatest Holocaust scholars among us. His work is of incredible importance. It is somehow synthesizing the works of hundreds of other people, while it gives the whole study of the Holocaust new aspects and formulates them really not only anew, but in some ways or other as an understanding of that where there were very, very many questions. People brought up these questions, and he seems to have pretty much answered them in depth. So please ask questions afterwards, but also be aware of the fact that we have to finish at 10 o'clock. On the other hand, you are welcome to join us in the Ackerman Center, so there is a possibility to ask him further questions. Thank you very much. Without much ado, I would like to ask Professor
Friedlander. Thank you very much, Professor Oshwat. As we are very restricted in time, I will try to speak briefly and leave more time for the questions if possible. And I mean, the aim of the lecture this morning, as I understood it when we corresponded, was to explain a little bit my project of an integrated history of the Holocaust by mentioning some of the questions which had been raised after I had finished. I mean, at the beginning, everybody seemed very happy, and then slowly but surely, as usual, and that's what historical dialogue, after all, is about. Questions were asked, and I found them mostly very much to the point, and I would like to take this occasion, as I did already a few times before, to answer them. And I will, at the beginning, try to clarify the concepts I used and mainly concentrate on the notion of conceptualization, that is, what could be the general concept allowing to interpret the Holocaust. My answer will be that it's impossible, but not everybody agrees with that. That's one point. And the second issue would be the witnessing, that is the use of testimonies in order to I will explain why I so much insisted on single voices in a way of diarists. And that also has been questioned. Less than the first one, but still questions. So I will really take those 2 points to make it simple and try to show the questions and to answer them. But before doing that, I would like to come back to the origins of the project. I mentioned it yesterday, but some of you probably were not at the lecture. And I want to go a little bit into details. Because this whole project took me 16 or 17 years writing, apart, of course, from the many years I had spent in the field itself, since '64, actually. So that there must have been a reason for starting. And I usually say it's a debate which took place, but no, it's more than that. And Professor Oschwart yesterday mentioned the historians' debate in Germany in the mid-'80s. And that indeed was not only a debate, but an atmosphere. The mid-'80s, some of you may remember that 40 years after the end of the war, there was a kind of not nationalism, but sense of we are something, we are somebody. 40 years after the war, Endschluss, Schlussstrich, end line after this long period. Let's not mention the atrocities of the Third Reich again. And that in '85 became very acute. You may remember the incident of Bitburg, some of you. That was the idea of bringing together President Reagan and Helmut Kohl, Chancellor Kohl, to honor the dead of the war in a cemetery, and Bitburg was chosen, a military cemetery, where American and German soldiers were buried. We speak now of April, May 1985, 40 years after the end of the war. And when the snow melted, it appeared that German soldiers buried there were mainly young Waffen SS. And that created an outcry here and also a lot of bad feelings in Germany that what they would be honoring were SS soldiers, although Waffen SS is not general SS, but still together with the Americans. So it created a lot of complications, but this was the time where the voices in Germany, I happened to be in Germany for almost a year at that very same time, became loud about, and let's put an end to this constant recalling of the Holocaust. And what it led to was what is called the historischer Streit, the debate of the historians about the past. The argument on one side was, well, there were some very strange arguments, like Thomas Mann's son, Goloman, wrote in Die Zeit, who would have considered the crimes of Napoleon 40 years after Waterloo? Well, the comparison was in itself already very weird, but the general debate was, were the crimes of National Socialism special in a way, the extermination of the Jews and other exterminations, or was it actually either a copy or just a replica to Soviet criminal activities? And so on the right, you would hear the voices saying, this was like the Soviets. Actually, the Soviets were the first, and we only have to defend, in a sense, to defend ourselves, had to use the same method. That was the most extreme. Then came the other side, led by a philosopher many of you may have heard of, Jürgen Habermas, and then many historians saying, no, there was a Einzigartigkeit, a special aspect to the criminality of National Socialism. So in this atmosphere of debate and of unpleasant arguments coming up, I started feeling very, let's say, agitated. And what added to the atmosphere was the fact that at the very same time, in the summer of '85, a literally anti-Semitic play was to be premiered at the Frankfurt Main Theater, a play by Rainer Werner Fassbinder, who is best known as a filmmaker, was, of course. And it took, on the day where it should have started, the Jewish community leaders of Frankfurt went on stage and sat on the stage so that the play never took place, but it showed a little bit of the atmosphere, in which then came my own debate with the person who was the head of the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich, Martin Broschat, who, in the debate which started between him and me about the historicization of National Socialism, that is returning National Socialism into history and stop it with this moralistic attitude. I mean, that was his argument. Let's stop with the black and white presentation of the events. Let's get back into history, historization. And I objected. And a year later or so, he suggested that we exchange 3 letters each and that we will publish them. And he said, and please quickly, I mean, don't hesitate to answer. We should do this quickly and publish it, each with his own arguments. And as I told yesterday, but it's worth repeating, his argument was the Jews. He said it more or less clearly. The Jew in the first letter, and their descendants, that is not the contemporaries of the events, cannot really write an objective history of those events because of their own subjectivity. So he says they have a memory which is worthy of respect, but it's a mythical memory of the events. And it's a mythical memory, again, worthy of respect, but which is an obstacle to a rational German historiography of the Third Reich. Meaning, actually, if I come to think of it, you know, the Jews dominate the media, mainly in the United States, and they project an image of the Holocaust, like, let's say, the film Holocaust and so on, which is mythical, which is black and white and false. And these media-created memory is a huge obstacle to our rational historiography. Well, I said yesterday I had to answer. I mean, I could not avoid answering by asking him if, having been in the Hitler Youth as he had been, wasn't creating also a kind of subjectivity, which made, for his generation of Germans, created the same difficulties as for us Jews of the same generation. And as I said, this created a lot of bad blood, which afterwards disappeared later on. So that was the atmosphere, and that is where I decided, and that explains my comments in a moment, to try to show that Jews could write this history, this overall history, taking the whole context into account and so on, and also looking at not only the black and white, but also the gray in this whole picture, but that the Jews also felt the need, at least that's what I wanted to say, to integrate the Jewish part of that history into the general history. So, in a way, making it clear twice over. Because, and that is the first explanation which I owe you, as all this was going on, and many years before, there was a Jewish history of the Holocaust developing separately, anyway, in Israel, at the Historical Institute in Warsaw at some time. Actually, during the war even during the war, you could say that the Oneg Shabbat archives of Ringelblum were already some kind of assembling of documents for the writing of this history, if anybody was left to write it. That was really the spirit of Ringelblum's work and of other Yiddish historians, mostly. Many of them died, but some survived the war, like Philip Friedman, and started writing actually a history of the Shoah, some in the camp, in the DP camps, displaced person camps, and others on their own in well, most of them left Eastern Europe, went to Israel or went to the United States, to YIVO, and so on, and started writing. But nobody in the general public of historians paid any attention to these attempts to recreate the Jewish world and its destruction during those years. It was a closed history, I would say, and it continued that way in Israel, Yad Vashem and other places, also in YIVO. German historiography didn't touch the Holocaust until the late 60s, by the way. Spoke of the German catastrophe, Meinecke, and other things like that, but surely didn't touch on the Holocaust. But when it started dealing with it slowly, and very slowly, the first international conference on the Holocaust ever held in Germany took place in '83. I happened to have been there in Stuttgart. '83 is a few decades after the end of the war. But in any case, even during those discussions, the Jewish part was simply not integrated. There were Jewish historians of the Holocaust, Raoul Hilberg, but they dealt with the German machinery of extermination, not with the life and death of the Jewish communities seen from the inside. And all this was written in Hebrew, in Yiddish, in English, of course, Isaiah Trunk and many others, Lucy Davidovich, and others in this country and elsewhere. So my intention was to bring those histories together and to have one, as I said, integrated history of the events, because you couldn't really understand the events and see their interconnection. And I will say a few words about that interconnection if you kept to separate histories, mostly then juxtaposed in textbooks, like you had various textbooks where you had the Germans, then Jewish resistance or something of the kind, then the French resistance or anything of maybe the churches, but one next to the other, which didn't allow the reader to really tie it together. So that was the intention, and as I said, the atmosphere in which all that came to my mind was an atmosphere of great, I would say, anxiety, even. That is this renewed argumentation about maybe Hitler actually only wanted to defend himself against the Soviet threat, and that's why he copied, in a way, the Soviet methods. So here we are at the beginning, and out came 2 volumes, The Years of Persecution until 1939, and then The Years of Extermination until 1945. Now, let me deal with the 2 topics which I mentioned at the beginning. they may be the essential topics, really, of this enterprise in terms of conceptualizing it. First, the idea or the question, if you put together those various histories, which I think was necessary and unavoidable in order to have a simultaneous vision of what was happening, let's say, in July 42, deportations from Amsterdam, deportations from Paris, deportations from Warsaw. Suddenly in July 42, wherever you look at Europe, the Germans start acting. Why exactly in July 42? And how did the Jewish communities react? And so on and so forth. How did the populations around react? How did the Poles react? How did the French react? How did the Dutch react? Was it the same? No, it was not the same. So you have to understand why at the same time you have similar and dissimilar reactions and so on. So the question was, if you do that, can you have one framework which would allow you to interpret this in a conceptual way which would make sense for all those histories? My answer was no. It is impossible because you cannot really create a conceptual framework which would include the Jewish past, which would include the German past, the French, and so on, which would include the whole operation of extermination in one concept which could explain its various aspects. Of course, there were concepts which applied more or less only to the Germans, but let's say to the extermination as such, like modernity. But modernity is so vague, you know, some of the books, Modernity and the Holocaust, it's very common in universities because it gives us very simple kind of background to events which are extraordinarily complicated. But at such a level of generalization, it's like saying human nature. Human nature, of course, human nature, but human nature doesn't explain much when you go down to the actual facts. So I used actually three very partial concepts. What I called redemptive anti-Semitism, I will come to it immediately. Then the notion of the collapse of the liberal order. Redemptive anti-Semitism, let's say, was mainly ideology. Collapse of the liberal order was the political context, and then the economic advantages of the disappearance of the Jews. So three very different concepts which could explain three major aspects, but couldn't really be put together. Redemptive anti-Semitism, in one simple word, is the notion not of anti-Semitism that we know, but of a kind of anti-Semitism, Hitler's anti-Semitism, which said either or. Either the Jews survived and humanity, Aryan humanity, Germany, Europe perish, or we rise, Deutschland erwache, and the Jews disappear. It was a notion of this is a struggle for life and death. And this is a kind of anti-Semitism which has nothing or little to do with the traditional religious or even social anti-Semitism. It was also not really coming out of racial anti-Semitism. Racial anti-Semitism, you could segregate the Jews and say they shouldn't touch the Aryans. But this kind of either or comes from the end of the 19th century and, my opinion, from the Bayreuth circle around not so much Richard Wagner, who was an anti-Semite, but chose always Jewish dirigenten to be in charge of Parsifal, for example. His widow, Cosima Wagner, and her circle were really I would say, the cultural source of this kind of rabid anti-Semitism. And of course, Houston Stuart Chamberlain, her son-in-law, Britisher, wrote the famous book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, where you have this notion, either or. And this was transmitted via a man called Dietrich Eckart to Hitler himself, and he added to it whatever he could find. Sometime on the more of the revolutions and World War I in 1819, he started expressing this view of the world and this view of history, which became his doctrine. I said yesterday, his first political letter, Hitler's first political letter, September 1999, was on the Jewish issue. Hitler's last sentence before committing suicide in his will was, and continue the struggle against this world pest, international Jewry. So from the very beginning, when he was still a corporal, a propaganda officer, as it was called, he was no officer, but propaganda officer in the military district of Munich, to the end of his career in the bunker under the Reichskanzlei, the Jewish question was at the center. So it is very difficult to say ideology plays no part. I mean, this was pure ideology, and that explains also, as I said yesterday, the drive to the very end. So that is one thing, but this could not, of course, could not mobilize, I would say, vast populations if there had not been the previous traditional anti-Semitism allowing, in a sense, this absolutely determined fanaticism to get ahead. If there had been countervailing forces, that is, opposite forces, this would have been limited, but there were none. I mean, if you look at Europe in the 30s, you don't see any business opposition, you don't see peasantry opposing, you don't see the churches opposing, and so on. So you had a drive, but you had no counter-drive. And that comes in part from the collapse of the liberal political system because of the pressure from the left, the communists, and the pressure from the extreme right, of course, the rise of fascism and Nazism. The liberal system, except in Great Britain and the United States, in continental Europe, was really falling to pieces. I know the French situation very well. Of course, you see it going down the drain, and then Vichy is the total collapse. So you have here two things, an ideology pushing, and then a system which integrated the Jews into European society, into European political society, collapsing, so that the Jews were left completely without their understanding it. Without them understanding it, they were left nowhere. And that in part explains, of course, afterwards that they could be caught. Anyway, they were, the anti-Semitic formula in the 20s and the 30s in France was from the extreme right, the Action Française. They may belong to the pays légal, to the legal country, but the Jews don't belong to the real country. Well, now they were expelled actually even from the legal country. And they simply didn't understand that they were hanging in the air. As Hannah Arendt wrote, you are not from the village, quoting Kafka in The Castle. You are not from the castle, you are not from the village, you are nothing at all. They were nothing except that they didn't understand it. And that's something I would like to talk about, but cannot in our very limited time, and I'm looking at my watch constantly. They were the last, and even to the very last moment, to understand what was happening to them. The French Jews were trying to convince the French government of Vichy that they were part of France, and that the foreign Jews maybe were not part of France, those who had emigrated to France. But we, Israelite Français, were part of this country. Our great-grandfathers have fought with Napoleon and so on and so forth. No, they didn't understand that this meant nothing. And the same, of course, the same with the Polish Jews, who had no such illusions, maybe. And there are some exceptions, but there are small exceptions. So, one last word about the economic advantages of the extermination of the Jews. This has been made into a very central argument over the last years. I cannot start explaining why, but if you look at each case, of course the Germans benefited immensely from whatever they could catch. But, and so did the others. I mean, there is a little sentence by a Polish observer in Vilna, that is in Lithuania, seeing the Jews being murdered in Ponar, nearby. And he says, well, for the Germans, 200 Jews were being shot. For the Germans, these are 200 enemies of humanity which have been liquidated. For the Lithuanians, these are 200 pairs of pants which they can use afterwards. I mean, yes, at the level of shoes and pants or bedding, or at the level of big companies, yeah, it was an advantage. I myself remember the post-war, immediate post-war years when the person in charge of me had to fight in court to get his apartment back in Paris because it had been Aryanized, that is taken over by non-Jewish family. And all that went to court and so on. It was an endless process, of course. So there is an economic advantage seen from the perpetrators or observers' part. But I could explain, but cannot explain because of the limitations here, that it never was the dominant aspect. I would say in terms of hierarchy, ideology, the collapse of the liberal political context, and of course economic advantages, but not the other way around as it has been argued recently. Now let me move to the second aspect which I wanted to discuss with you, and that is the use of witnessing, which is different. If I wanted to integrate the Jewish history into the general history, and that was, as I said, the aim, then how could I do it? Of course, I could use the Jewish historiography, the histories written, let's say, in Hebrew or in Yiddish, about the history of this ghetto and that community and so on. There was a huge material. So, of course, I had to be aware of it and try to bring it into the general narrative. But my aim was different. My aim was to find a way of not only explaining and integrating in the most minute way, but also giving something of the atmosphere of the time by showing the shock, by creating, in a way, in the reader, a replica of the shock which had been felt by the victims, by the Jews, when they suddenly understood what was going on with them. Or to show to the reader how these same Jews actually didn't understand to the very last moment what was going on with them. And to do that, I had to use witnesses, but not in order to illustrate something, but suddenly their voices had to come up through the historical description in order to create the same effect on the reader as it would have been created, let's say, if one may say, right, at the time, by somebody writing a diary and say, what's going on here? What's going on? And so I collected diaries and diaries. I rarely used memoirs. I myself wrote a memoir, didn't, of course, use it. Neither did I use most memoirs. There are thousands and thousands, because we memorialists have then reconstructed with as much veracity as a human mind can do. And Professor Oshwat also wrote a memoir, she knows that. But we do the history. And if you want it or not, you reconstruct the past with some knowledge. So I kept away practically constantly from memoirs, using only diaries written on the moment, mostly, except one or two major diaries, mostly diaries of Jews killed before the end of the war, not only because they were, in a sense, more immediate, more touching, no, but I was sure also that they couldn't have been reorganized, rewritten after the war, which happened with some diaries, which went, the authors of which had survived the war. So, and those diaries, I have some 30 diaries in the book. I chose them from every corner of Europe, from every corner of occupied Europe, from Norway to Greece, from Belgium, of course, to Italy. And you find mostly young diarists, all perished. And to give you a sense of what a diary like that means for the writer and 15-year-old boy in Brussels, and for the reader, the diarist is very religious. It's an Orthodox Jewish family that fled from Amsterdam to Brussels, and they were living there under another name. And the diarist writes, how can it be that God allows this, what is happening to the Jews? Did we sin so much that we should be punished? This is a 15-year-old boy, that we should be punished in such a way. And his whole diary is a kind of dialogue with God. Is it really that we are so bad, that we are really so worthless that you punish us in such a way? Then he comes to the conclusion, he says, no, it cannot be. It cannot be. The suffering is much more than any sin of ours could have been. Therefore, maybe it's the sign of redemption. You know, the ultimate suffering bringing the redemption. I mean, this is a diary which shows simply some youngster fighting with himself, with his face, with God, with what is happening. These are pages which, I mean, will never disappear, because they show the most intimate torture, I would say, of, in that case, a young man, or you have a young communist in Vilna, more or less writing the same things, but then thinking of the international movement and where is the Soviet Union and so on and so forth. So that is the picture you have. But you have also the sense that the Jews were the last to understand, the last, because the others did understand afterward, to understand what was happening to them. That is why they submitted so meekly to what was going on, because they still believed to the very end that they would be sent to work camps and not to immediate death. And yesterday I gave an example, which I have to repeat, of that young woman in Paris who in 1944, that is very close to the liberation of France, she perished, of course, was working at the Hôpital Rothschild, the hospital for Jews in Paris, and she writes in her diary, the diary was published 2 years ago, so Helen Baer is her name. Yesterday they took a woman paralyzed, 42 people were taken. And she describes their illnesses, that is, their total incapacity of even getting out of bed. And she says, these people, how will they work in Poland? I mean, they will die on the way. She could not understand that they would not work, that they would be killed. That simply couldn't enter her mind. It's like a terminal patient saying, yeah, I have but a few days, but next year we will do this and that and go on vacations. And we all know those situations. So these were the diaries. This was my intent. Now, the criticism of this was, well, we all know those diaries. And today, they do not create the shock they did after the war. They create a kind of nostalgia. There's only one person who said that, but I refer to it. No. The diaries are unknown mostly, but the question is, should one use the iconic diaries? Let's say the diary of Anne Frank, which is known practically by every child because you read it in school and so on. What should you do with those things that are really known? Do they still have an effect? I did introduce Anne Frank. I could not introduce Anne Frank. But my conclusion is that it's not the diary, whether it's known or not, which creates the effect. It's the need to hear those things. And let's take first the First World War. After the war and throughout the 30s, you had commemorations, you had monuments, you had all kinds of, you had, of course, a lot written by the soldiers, about the soldiers, because various nations in Europe and beyond had a memory of the event, needed, in a way, those testimonies. As long as a society needs those testimonies, they echo each time anew. And Anne Frank read again today by a young girl of 11 or 12 or 13, nowadays will have the same effect as when it was read the first time by youngsters wherever in Europe. So in a way, it's the need for memory which gives their impact to those personal testimonies. And that leads me to my last point, to my very last conclusion. The question is, I mean, I gave the World War I as an example. The memory of World War I has partly disappeared as a living memory. The question is whether this is going to happen to the memory of the Holocaust. The question asked by practically everybody, saying, well, now that generation of those who still lived through it is disappearing necessarily, what will happen to that memory? My feeling is, of course, there will be various intensities, but my feeling is that this memory is not about to disappear very rapidly, because there is something that continues to bother not only those who are linked to it somehow, the Germans, the Jews, and no, bother Western, European, whatever, Western civilization. That there was a kind of moral weakness in what we call our civilization, and that in the face of extraordinary exterminations of the Jews and of the Gypsies and of the mentally ill and of Soviet and Polish populations and in general, millions of dead, and you could say, and also Stalinist. People kept quiet, didn't intervene, and yesterday I gave that example. It was to think that 1,000 major German figures would have protested is inconceivable because people are afraid, and afraid for themselves, for their families. That 100 or 20 did not protest. It's strange that not one protested publicly is still incomprehensible. Thank you very much.
Oh, we are having still a rich
Exactly
40
a quarter of an hour.
So, would you be so kind and ask some questions? Would you be interested? Yes.
How do you view the archives of the Nazis? How do you view the archives of other organizations, the Vatican Press? Are they out there now? Is there more to be received?
The archives, most archives are open regarding the Nazi period. Most, not the Vatican. I know that because I wrote a book on Pius XII, and at that time my publisher in France went to the Vatican and said, this person has the German documents, would you open to him the Vatican documents? The answer in '64 was no, and very recently, 5 years ago, a commission of historians, Catholic and Jewish, was established under the acceptance and under the guidance, in a way, of the Vatican, in order to examine what has been published up to now. Not from the archives, but volumes that had been published by the Vatican. And as the Jewish members of the commission said, but here are documents which should be in the publications of the Vatican. So we have them. These are reports sent to the Vatican in 43, 42. Could we see them? Could we see the originals? The answer was no, and the commission disbanded. So there is no way, except for the period of Pius XI until 39, but no way to get to the archives of Pius XII from March 39 to the 50s.
Any other question?
Yes, can you comment on why the countries that did not participate, like Bulgaria, what was the difference between the feeling of the church and the government there as opposed to the rest of Europe?
Yes, that's a very good question. Bulgaria, Denmark, a little bit Italy. Why? Bulgaria is a complicated case. As you know, the Bulgarian government and the king, King Boris still, accepted the deportation of the foreign Jews from Thracia and Macedonia. When it came to the Bulgarian Jews, like in France then, there was resistance to let the Germans take the Bulgarian Jews, and you know, it was 43, the war was turning. The Russians were winning one battle after the other, so Bulgaria, close to the Soviet Union, was changing its mind, but it's true. The Bulgarian church intervened, the Bulgarian parliament was in uproar. The Bulgarians defended Bulgarian Jews. They delivered the foreign Jews.
You know, history is a lot of facts, which can be debated, but there's also the philosophy and the psychology of history. You brought up about how none of the Germans, non-Jews, stood up against it. What is your feeling about why that happened? It was more than fear.
You know, I have asked myself the question. It's not absolute. What I said is not absolutely true. I said no personality of high rank, no famous, let's say, intellectual, no well-known prelate, Catholic or Protestant. So on a lower rank, we have a few German voices which were heard and were squashed immediately by the Gestapo and so on. So it's not true that in Germany, people of various contexts did not say a thing. But you didn't hear one, at least if somebody knows differently, I would like to hear it. Now, nobody of the rank of bishop, let's say, speaking publicly. And the interesting thing is that a Catholic Bishop Preising in Berlin, a very remarkable personality, by the way, and Bishop Wurm, a Protestant bishop in Württemberg, both of them tried to sent letters to Hitler's chancellery to say what are the rumors we are hearing from soldiers coming back about the fate, and they were the word Jew never appeared, about groups being massacred and so. It was clear whom they were alluding to, but they also alluded to general atrocities on the Eastern Front. Then the secretary of the chancellery wrote a letter to each of them saying, stop sending these letters and stop this kind of non-official protests. They stopped. That is, nobody chose martyrdom. Nobody decided, whatever happens, I speak. This was not the case for the killing of the mentally ill. When Bishop Gallen got up in church in Cathedral of Münster in August 1941 and said, how long will this go on? Will our soldiers coming back from the Eastern Front without limbs be killed because they are useless to society? And I will sue the party for criminal. You know, speaking in the cathedral, the question was in Hitler's entourage, what does one do with that man? Have him executed or what? And Hitler himself, you see the pragmatic aspect of the fanatic, saying, no, no, not now. Russian campaign, we don't want to have problems with the Catholic community. After the war, we'll take care of the bishop and of any Catholics. But the same bishop, as I said yesterday, was asked by an anonymous Jew, of course anonymous, a letter which is found in his archives. You were so heroic about the mentally ill. Could you say a word about what's happening to us, the Jews? Gallen never answered or never said anything.
Yes, one. Do we have? Yes, we have one.
It was very interesting to hear about the two components of anti-Semitism that in the context of redemptive anti-Semitism, how essential was Hitler's role as a key ingredient in the Holocaust, and would that happen without Hitler's role and exponent?
It's a great question, but in a few words, all the ingredients were there. And I said the Bayreuth Circle, but you could find others and bring it together, end of 19th century, more or less. And through World War I, of course, and then explodes after the defeat of 1918. Yet you needed somebody in power to push it ahead as in order to get in action. That is, you couldn't, if those ideas had been held only by small groups out of power, not in power, well, it would have been one more group of fanatics, but it wouldn't have changed anything. But it so happens that that group, the National Socialist Party, because of the depression and so on, suddenly rose to the way it did arise, and then Hitler was called to the chancellorship. At that moment, you had somebody who in himself was carrying all those elements, head of Germany. And then dictator, if you wish, of Germany, sole authority. And in a way, without that, no Holocaust, of course. And it's not that Hitler thought of killing the Jews in 1933. He did mention it in 1935 in a very roundabout way too. We have documents on that. But it's really in 1941, and I will end on that, in 1941, when the war became a general war with the Japanese, the Americans, and of course the Russians not being beaten but counterattacking in front of Moscow, that the question was now, what do we do with the internal enemy, this mortal enemy, which I always described as mortal enemy, and he said, if there is again a general war, not the Aryan people will be destroyed, that's his famous speech to the Reichstag, but the Jews will be exterminated. That's 1939. Now we had the general war. He said, I have been a prophet, and now the prophecy, and so on. He couldn't retreat also from what, and in any case, he didn't want to retreat. So without Hitler in power, difficult to say you would have had the driving force, but he was there.
I think perhaps we say thank you very much. And come upstairs if you can.